The sea, so fascinating, so wonderful. Here we see Bikini Bottom, teeming with life, home to one of my favorite cartoons, SpongeBob SquarePants. Yes, of course he made a new film, you silly. Which reminds me, there's a new SpongeBob film that finally came out after being delayed month after month after month. May 2020? You wish. So with such a sad and grim year, maybe all that we need is a classic SpongeBob adventure so we can endure the last months of this year. And as I said, SpongeBob is arguably one of my favorite cartoons of all time. And like most people, I believe that SpongeBob should have ended with the first film. The first 3 seasons are some of the greatest work ever made by Nickelodeon. But the show has since fallen a downward spiral and never reached the heights it once had. Or should I say, Nickelodeon refuses to simply let it die. A lot of people stopped watching after season 3, but I watched well into season 8 and 9. Simply because, as a kid, I didn't know any better, but reminiscing about it now, it was like watching 2 completely different shows. But now, we don't just have one SpongeBob movie, but rather an entire trilogy of SpongeBob movies. So let's see how the other SpongeBob movies have fared before we dive into the new one. I think this is just classic SpongeBob fun. Great animation mixed with great humor. What else needs to be said? Well, technically there are better animation films, and I wouldn't say that this is like a masterpiece or anything like that. This film will always have a soft spot in my heart. There are so many classic lines in this film. It would have been the perfect way to end the show and be an incredible send-off to SpongeBob, but it wasn't. Now with this film I can be more critical. Not only because I watched it when I was older, but because you can clearly see what works and what doesn't work in this film. One thing I was scared of was that the promotional material really showed the 3D footage of them at the end of the film, which I really didn't like the idea that much. Thankfully that was only the 3rd act of the film and not the entire movie, which the 3rd act is also the worst part of the film, but overall those first 2 acts were actually very reminiscent of classic SpongeBob. Which makes sense because many people that hadn't worked in SpongeBob for years returned for this, including the creator Steven Hillenburg. This obviously helped the film tremendously, but even with that, it was still not that good and kind of a lackluster. I'd give it a 6 just because overall the animation in the first 2 acts is pretty good, and there's this neat World War I style sequence, which I do feel it was very reminiscent of classic SpongeBob, something we hadn't seen for years. And if we're honest, we still haven't. Which leads us to... Now, I had my doubts about this film. Could it learn from what the previous film did wrong? Could it show us that there is still plenty of life in the sponge? Or would it just make us reminisce more and more about the good old days? Well, let's start by praising the things it did right. I mentioned how in the previous film, I kinda disliked how it went away from the classic 2D animation in the final act, as it looked too clean and it lacked the cartoony essence that made SpongeBob so unique in the first place. Well, it seems that was foreshadowing for what they were planning in the future, as this film completely throws away the 2D animation down the window, and instead goes for a similar style to that of Into the Spider-Verse. I had my doubts at first, but honestly, this might be the best thing in the film. Sure, there were a couple moments that felt like it would have been better in 2D animation, but overall, this was a pretty good transition from 2D to 3D. There's this really good scene where they show off the animation when they are in the lost city of Atlantic City, yeah that's the name, and displayed in a very vibrant and colorful way. You know, just like SpongeBob should be. Okay, now let's get into the parts that aren't that good. So what's the story? Well, just like the previous film, it takes a story that has already been done before with things we've already seen and changes it up a little. Gary gets kidnapped by a king that uses him in order to keep his beauty, as Plankton realizes that SpongeBob is who he needs to get rid of so that he can get the Krabby Patty formula, and sets the story in motion. The plot is also very predictable. Essentially, all that you think that will happen, does happen. Along the way, he meets with the obligatory guest star, which is fine. The first film had David Hasselhoff, the second one had Antonio Banderas, and this one has Keanu Reeves and Danny Trejo. So I'm guessing Reddit's going to love this. Snoop Dogg also appeared in the film in the most out of place music number of the entire movie. But it's Snoop Dogg, so I can't be too upset. Could have been worse, much worse. There were a few times I chuckled throughout the film, but not too many. If you think this is going to be a knee slapper, beware. Other than that, I can't help but feel there's like a lack of heart throughout this whole movie. Beyond its colorful coat of paint, you can't really feel the passion that made the original so good, and even in the second one there were slivers you could see throughout the film that did have that heart, which this film sorely lacks. There were also moments where it felt like it wanted to conclude some aspects, which I'm not gonna spoil here, but it felt kind of like a conclusion in a certain way, which is odd because Nickelodeon is not gonna let that happen in at least the next century. Which brings me to the worst thing this film does. Now, while the story was okay for the most part, there was one part that stuck out as a sore thumb of much worse things to come. Throughout the film, there were these brief flashbacks to explain how SpongeBob basically met everyone, which completely goes against what Stephen wanted, as he described him as ageless. That's why he both went to school but also had a job. It was meant to be relatable to both kids and adults. One particularly egregious scene is in which Kid SpongeBob meets with Kid Sandy, which not just goes against what Stephen wanted, but against the main lore of the show. Sandy and SpongeBob meet in the first season. How could you mess this up so bad? How can you go against the main show? This has made me really scared of the future of SpongeBob. Now, I don't want to speak too much about this subject, because I'm going to cover this in a later video, but let's just say that be afraid of the future of SpongeBob. Be very afraid. At its best, Sponge on the Run is a fun, visually pleasing film that has humor and can keep you entertained for an hour and a half. At its worst, it's a film that does the bare minimum to keep you entertained due to its lack of heart that brings nothing new to the table and fails to understand the flaws that both the current SpongeBob and the previous film made. With films like Into the Spider-Verse being so eager to use the foundation of its franchise to push it forward into a new direction, Sponge on the Run feels oddly calm, barely trying to innovate, and that's its biggest failure, because SpongeBob can be many things, but it shouldn't be boring. It's hard to rate this film because honestly I did enjoy a couple of moments of it, and I don't see it as something like a sin against God or anything like that. It's not an insult to the fans, so I'd say that it's not lower than a 5, but definitely not higher than a 6. So yeah, make up your own conclusions about that. I know that there are some people that are like, you took an hour and a half out of my life and I want it back. Well, let's be honest, you would have wasted it anyway. But good film or bad film, as long as there are stars in the sky, SpongeBob will live on in our hearts and in our minds. Now get lost. I mean bye. No, really, get lost.